Today we are going to talk about a very, very special game before your eyes. Man, this game is special. It really is. My first playthrough of this game, I was smiling a lot until I wasn't. Of course, as the subject matter of this game becomes serious. It's actually serious throughout, and yet it's also very joyous. And I think that that's often the mark of great art, that it's both very serious and very joyous, because that is what life is. I'm going to jump right into what I think is my big realization about this game regarding this sort of core mechanic that is what a lot of people think about when they think about this game. What a lot of people think about is this whole blinking thing that this game uses as a mechanic. The idea of this game, or the sort of mechanic that makes this game very, very unusual, is that whenever you blink, you move forward. Not always, sometimes it hasn't sort of like set in yet in the scene, but once you see the metronome going, and I didn't quite know what to make of it for a little bit. I think I realized sort of halfway through the game when I was having trouble keeping my eyes open for certain moments, and then sometimes I was trying really hard to fully see a certain moment and I was able to, but then the next moment I would my eyes would be more dry, and so it'd be harder for me to do. And that's when I realized that I think what blinking is in this game is a metaphor for consciousness. It's a metaphor for being present in a moment. And it does that in a lot more ways than just the blinking mechanic. If it just had the blinking mechanic but it didn't have a touching story, then it would fail. But it's because it has this blinking mechanic that represents your ability to stay conscious and to be present, plus all the other things that are all speaking to that same topic. Just to go a little deeper, in case you aren't totally sold on my theory yet, the reason I think blinking works really well as a metaphor for consciousness or being present is that blinking is something we have control over until we don't. So we're able to consciously not blink, but we can't do that forever because we have a certain store. We have a certain bank that we can access, and then eventually it gets tapped out and we have to blink, and our body will force us to blink. And that's very similar to our ability to remain conscious and aware and present in a moment, because that's something we have control over, but that we can't do forever, because it takes energy, it takes focus. And so if you're really, really developed in your ability to be aware and present, hopefully the only times you don't do it are when you're sleeping. That's when you're restoring yourself. That's when you're building up your bank again. The entire day, every day, you're able to be present and you're able to be aware. But for most people, that's difficult. And so we have our moments that we aren't aware. And the real tragedy is when we end up basically sleepwalking through our lives. And we don't have memories of the things that truly mattered. And we weren't present for the things that were truly meaningful. That's what this game is about for me. And I think blinking works really well for that, because the similarities in having control but not having complete control. So there were certain moments when I really wanted to sort of close my eyes for a bit to sort of store up blinks. And I don't know, even that sort of reminded me of actual life and trying to rest, to be most present for the moments that really matter in my life. I think this game is actually very metaphysical almost, or spiritual, in encouraging you to be more present in your own life. Like I mentioned, the accidental blinks, those moments when we accidentally blink while we're playing this game and we move through something that we actually wanted to see, and how similar that is to our own lives. When there might be something that's really meaningful in our life and we just don't have the bandwidth to be fully present for that moment. And then maybe when we reflect on the memory, it's not really fully there because we weren't fully present. And that's another big thing I realized about this mechanic of blinking that's so brilliant. The whole game, we're going through the memories of this main character, Benny, that we're playing. And when you really try hard to keep your eyes open during one section of this game, and then you don't have as much of a storage for the next section, and then you kind of don't see all of it, well, that's a memory. Everything, or most of what we're going through in this game, is memories. Everything related to Benny's life before he goes to the river and meets the ferryman, that's all memories. And that made me think about how certain memories leave us and certain memories stay. And a lot of times we don't feel like we really have control over that. And sometimes we wish that we did, and we wish that we were more present in the moments that we really wish would stay with us and that we'd be able to remember well because they were really meaningful. Maybe some of the ones that we'd really like to have are the ones that left. And using blinking as a metaphor for the sort of consciousness or ability to be present that we have in every day-to-day moment, this game reminds us that we need to be present in order to have some of these most meaningful memories fully. Or maybe that just in this game, when we're holding our eyes open, and in real life when we're really focused and there, maybe then we can access some of those memories. Maybe even if we weren't fully present when that experience first happened to us, when we're later trying to recall that experience, if we make ourselves or prepare ourselves to be most present and we are most aware, then we can access that memory. This is kind of the first part, where I just wanted to cover these really, I think, brilliant choices in this mechanic of blinking, which I think metaphorically represents something much deeper and more important to this game. I'm just going to take this moment to say that if you like my content, please subscribe and like or rate this wherever you're consuming it. So now we're going to be moving into the second part of this episode. Let's get into the story. With some games, story is not the thing that I find most interesting or most special about the artistic expression in the game. But in this game, I think it's very fundamental to it. The growth of the characters and their realizations, I think, dovetails perfectly with what I talked about with the blinking and what that means. And it wouldn't really work to make us reflect on being present in our own lives if this story weren't dealing with those topics itself. And we see that in the growth and the arc of the characters in this game. So I think it actually is really good to go through this story. I think it'll also be helpful in general for the podcast for me to go through story structure in a more involved way. Most stories, in fact, the vast majority of solid stories have a 3-act structure. So Act 1 is what you know as the exposition. Act 1 will be sort of giving you a little bit about the world that you're in, the rules of how this world works, probably some of the main characters, almost always the main character that you're going to be following mostly, but other characters. And it will sort of introduce you also to the central tension that's going to be building through the rest of the story. The seeds for that are often planted early in Act 1, and then you sort of see it starting to come to fruition at the end of Act 1 as you get into Act 2. But it kind of just lets you know what's going on. And in Act 1 of this game, so it's the very beginning, it's actually very clever at the beginning of this game. And for the audio listeners, I'm just showing this first screen that pops up. And the very first thing you read is, this is a game about blinking. And I find this to be actually brilliant. Because, yeah, it's telling you about the mechanic, and it explains it a little bit further. But I actually think it's telling you about a lot more than just the mechanic. I think that this game is about blinking, but it's also not at all a game about blinking. I think that this is a game about what blinking represents, which, as I already explained, I think is basically about that conscious faculty that we have to focus and be present on the things we experience in our lives. I think that this game is clever and figurative enough throughout the rest of the game that there's no way that they wouldn't have thought about the first line enough to be implying that, wink wink, this is not just a game about literally blinking. So in Act 1, we arrive in this river, And we later realize, because we learn more about this story and our situation, that this is like the river Styx in Greek mythology, or like in many mythologies and many cultures, they have a story of some kind of river that will transport us to the next place. And we're scooped up by this ferryman, this gentleman, humanoid dog with 1 ear. He's a very intriguing character from the beginning because we don't really understand him fully.
Now you see that tower out there? Big, scary one? That's where I'm taking you to see the gatekeeper, to be judged. I'm gonna present your case, tell her the whole story of your entire life from prow to stern. Now if she's impressed, I get paid the Bitcoin, and you get yourself a spot in her magnificent city. If she ain't, well, I eat seagull for dinner again, and you, well, we don't have to worry about that, because I am the best orator you'll find on these sickly waters.
He's telling you about the gatekeeper. He's telling you what his role is in this story, that he's going to be the storyteller orator who's going to convince her to let you in. And so that's situating us, right? Otherwise, without an act one in a story, the problem is that we just don't get what's going on. And human beings, when we're reading a story and we're extremely confused for long enough, we lose interest. Even the most confusing stories give you something that grounds you. The ferryman here tells you about the gatekeeper. He then tells you that you're going to show him your entire life. You're going to go back through your memories. And that's just another way to ground us and to let us know what's happening. And then he sends you back. And so Act 2, what is Act 2? In Act 2, we get rising action. So we get steadily rising action with some valleys and, loop-de-loop sometimes. But in general, we get a building up of the story to some kind of big moment where there's kind of like a showdown to face that central tension and resolve that central tension. The ferryman, who we later learned, his name is Flapjack, he says, you're going to go through all your memories. And the stakes are being allowed in by the gatekeeper. And that's when we know, okay, this is how he's going to learn about the story he needs to tell the gatekeeper. This is the journey we're taking. And so in Act 2, we open just on this really intimate moment with our mother on this beautiful ocean. And we can quickly tell just by the way the woman is speaking to us that she is our mother and we are a baby, basically. Like, why are you smiling like that? She says. And that's just it's honestly kind of like a cheat code to get us invested. This bond, this sort of really intimate bond between a parent and child, even if we're playing the infant, not the parent, it's like hardwired into most of us, most people, that this creates a very strong bond. And then we start to see the growing up. We're introduced to both parents. The father, Richard, he's very compassionate, he's very kind, he's very warm, but he's kind of portrayed almost as like, he has this very nerdy interest in, as he is a professor of naval history. But the mother is the driving force through this story. And we see that she is very passionate about her art, which is making music. And she's kind of the driving force because the arc that Benny himself, who we play, goes through is that of art. She's also literally the one who drives us directly because she pushes Benny to pursue music. But we early on see her disappointment when her musical work doesn't progress. We also meet Ernie, who's this cat that the father, Richard, finds with one eye, who's a source of warmth and companionship for Benny. This story as a whole is just very intimate. It really focuses on these moments of warmth and companionship and family and friendship that mark the most meaningful moments of our lives. We see Benny grow in his abilities with the piano as his mother teaches him. His mother is named Elle, by the way. we get to a very, very important sort of kicking off point for the rest of the story. We see, as we do in many good stories, we see a moment when it's almost like everything speeds up. The momentum becomes so much greater for the rest of the story, and characters change because of some often traumatic event, but just some important event happens that kind of gets the ball really rolling down the hill quickly. But the mother tells you about her father, and she tells you about what her father taught her about life.
You know, my father once told me, when I was about your age, the only way to fight against time is to create a work of genius which might live on after you're gone. So I asked him, what about your children? Thinking, I might be a work of genius just as I was. He said, yes, I suppose. If you made a work of genius, I could live on through that as well. No such luck for me. I haven't seen him in over 10 years.
We get really a very fundamental core part of Elle, our mother's upbringing, and something that has deeply embedded itself in her belief system. What her father taught her, that the only way to live on is to create a work of genius. And really strongly implied in that statement is you get the sense that really the only way to live a meaningful life is to create a work of genius. Her father has taught her that this is what life is about, to make something great. Not to be present in every little moment. That's not really what matters. What matters is to create something great. And this really is a tipping off point to get that boulder rolling down the hill very quickly in the way our mother acts. We then afterwards see a phone call that Benny is moving towards, but we don't hear it. And after, we sense very quickly that there's a very big shift in how the mother treats us. She seems much more committed to driving us towards musical greatness. And a lot of her softness leaves her. We can already sense that it has something to do with that work of genius that her father imparted in her and made her believe is really what life is about. She's not a good mother. After she talks about that, creating something great, and she's very focused on getting somewhere. She's very focused on making Benny get somewhere, pushing him, making him live out her dreams. That's one of the very common stumbling blocks of parenthood. If a parent pushes a child to do something that they themselves wanted to do, and they push the child to live their dreams, to achieve what they wanted to achieve, that's a really very central mark of bad parenting. And she does that. And that is really a huge part of the central tension of the story between sort of living life to strive for greatness as our mother pushes him to, or to live life grounded by the present. We meet the only friend that Benny makes, Chloe here. I just want to talk actually a little bit about the scene composition. A lot of the scene composition is very, very creative and very, very effective. There's a real emphasis on intimacy. A lot of times that's done by having us focus on one thing visually and then having audio kind of behind us so that we really can focus on a few things rather than cluttering up our field of vision. In this scene, we're seeing nighttime. Nighttime just has an energy of intimacy. It feels more drawn within. More intimate things usually happen at nighttime because we aren't running around. We aren't as active. It's more about relationships. And so having this encounter at nighttime when Chloe is playing outside and needs to go in is a very good way of establishing some kind of intimacy very early on in this relationship. And then another example of what I was just saying about having us focus on one thing while having the audio completely out of our field of vision is when we are playing this work.
Since he was 4 or 5 years old.
And what do you do, Richard?
He's a professor.
Of what?
Well, no one really knows.
No, I mean, what's his field?
It's maritime archaeology.
So we are focusing on playing the piece, but we're hearing all this dialogue behind us. That's a really good way of making us really focus on that dialogue. Film will often do that when something's over black and you just hear someone talking. It really makes us focus in and pay attention to what's being said. So I'm going to talk just a little bit more about why it's so clear to me that this game is really about being present. And I'll talk more about that later because it's very important to the actual resolution of the story. But we see in various scenes, the quote-unquote stay here scenes, you eventually have a choice to basically be kind of reckless and go outside with Chloe and to go sleep on the beach under the stars the night before your audition. Either choice you make, you have this very intimate scene with someone that you care about. And in that moment, the stars allow you to write these kind of constellations of saying, stay here. This is a very clear message that this is where Benny is most contented. This is where Benny is truly living. And this is what his life is really about, is just being in these moments. And I'll talk more about this as his mother finally realizes that, because that's a very central thing to this story, is his mother's character arc. So there's a fairly long section of this game when Benny learns that he's going to be sick and he's going to be home for a while. He gets really into the visual arts, and that takes this whole journey of this career as a painter. I'm actually not going to talk extremely in depth about this section, though it does relate to this need to strive forward and accomplish this great thing. We get a very classic moment here that is very common in many Act 2s. One really prototypical example would be looking at The Empire Strikes Back, which is basically the Act 2 of the original Star Wars trilogy. This big moment where it feels like everything is lost. It's a way that writers really, really make you worry and really, really get on the hook. This is when Flapjack becomes very, very upset with you because he has realized now that your story, the story of your life, your memories, part of them are fabricated, and you're also skipping out on certain things. This is when it feels like there's no coming back from this.
Now don't think that I haven't dealt with people like you. You're ashamed of something. Something so terrible, you're trying to blink right past it. Because if the gatekeeper knew, she'd have to dream up fresh new hells to punish someone as worthless as you. And I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're the rottenest soul that I ever fished out of that black muck. And I should have thrown you back and sanitized my paw as soon as I laid eyes on you.
Oof, man, they really amped that up. It's all over. This is not going to end well. It's like the big drop on the roller coaster. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about this lie that Benny is telling Flapjack, the ferryman. What does this lie represent? Benny is leaving out certain things, and he's also making up certain things. He's created this fantasy of what he wanted life to be. I think really what this represents in this story, because I think this story is all about our own lives, and we're supposed to draw parallels and conclude certain things about how to live our own lives from this game, because this game is really brilliant. I think what it represents, what it addresses, is how sometimes we don't want to face the worst parts of our lives. There are certain things we'd rather skip over. And there are certain things that we don't want to look at and we want to repress and stuff down. And then there are certain things certain fantasies that we want to believe we lived instead, that we want to create in our heads. We want to fabricate that we lived a different way. And I think that this lie and then us facing it really tells us how important it is, how important the truth is in our own lives. That we have to look at those things that we don't want to look at, and we have to process them and fully account for them and take responsibility for them if there are things that we did that we didn't like, that we did. And then we also need to look at the fantasies and fabrications that we created in our own heads about what our lives were, and clear them out also, and just see what life actually is. and also what it was. See the truth of it. The rest of this story, to me, is telling us how beautiful it can be when we do that. Even when it's really hard stuff, even when it's even horrible stuff, incredibly sad stuff, how beautiful that can be. Flapjack the Ferryman then sends us back through everything to see what Benny skipped over. And we learn of Elle learning of her father's death, which is a very, very big moment that, as I said, really, really gets the ball rolling down the hill quicker. She becomes so much more driven to push Benny to fulfill and achieve the things that she did not achieve, because really her father has instilled in her this belief that a life is only worth living if you create something great. Then we also learn the big kahuna, which is we learn the full truth about Benny's illness. And this was sort of one of the things that hit me hardest on my second playthrough, actually, was seeing how Benny's parents reacted to Benny's illness. As Benny's illness progresses, he writes this story about himself, which turns out to be really the source of the fabricated memories. We see this process play out of his illness becoming worse and worse and worse, and also not telling Chloe about it, and her eventually coming and them sharing this very heartfelt, intimate moment. It's one of those things that can't be talked about in a way that even remotely matches the impact of experiencing it. So I'm just going to let the experience stand for itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about this death scene, which was very impactful to me. My second playthrough, this made me very emotional. I wept as I saw how his parents were dealing with it and how his parents were feeling as death was approaching. And then the death scene itself, or the moment of death, I guess I should say, on my first playthrough, I found myself holding my eyes open as the metronome was telling me that I can close my eyes and slip away. Even though I knew nothing more was coming, I knew that there was no more story here. I just was holding my eyes open to not slip away, to not have Benny die. Even though it was all over. I just wanted to be present in that last moment. It made me want to be present in every moment. And the fact that I just naturally was doing that just shows how effective this story was. Man, I just wanted to stay there. And then when Benny does slip away, when you do close your eyes, then we get into Act 3.
You know, for a while now, I've wondered if I'm just not a good enough storyteller. If I just don't have grand enough words, can't tell grand enough stories. But grand words and stories, I think they may be overrated. I know just what to tell her.
Wow. After everything we've gone through, after learning about the lies and the fabrication, the things that Benny understandably didn't want to look at again, but then eventually faced, Flapjack just kind of puts a bow on it. He puts a bow on this whole message of being present is all that matters. When he says that, I think words and stories are overrated. It doesn't matter to him anymore to color it up and to sell it as a certain thing. He's realized, as we've realized through the story, that what matters is just to see things for what they are. That's it. And so he says that, and he tosses the thesaurus. He doesn't need to think of fancy ways to say things anymore. He just needs to tell the truth. And he says that with his last line. He says, I think I know just what to tell her. He's just going to tell the truth. That's all he's going to do. So this is Act 3. And what Act 3 is we've seen the central tension through. And something happened, some big showdown or some big event that has sort of dissolved this tension. And we can breathe a sigh of relief as we go into a period of reflection. We get this very nice touch that the gatekeeper that we meet, as was foreshadowed by the history teacher when he talked about Anubis and Ma'at, the gatekeeper is taking really the form of Ernie. Ernie, his warm and constant companion. Now we get to the moment that hit me the hardest on my first playthrough. During my first playthrough, I was actually surprised almost. Because I'd seen so many very emotional things in Benny's life, yet I hadn't become overcome by emotion. And I hadn't been holding myself back at all. I just hadn't. And then we got to this moment. And it was almost like it had been held back by the fact that we hadn't seen the most important thing. A lot of what had driven the tension in the story was that Benny's mother had been driving him to succeed. In her own mind, she had failed because her father instilled in her this belief that a life is really not worth much if you haven't accomplished this work of genius. And so she had been forcing Benny to succeed and to achieve on this railroad towards a work of genius. It was almost more important to my resolution, to my catharsis, that she learned that that's not what life is about. And when she did, that's when it all broke free.
Benjamin Brynn was born into an ordinary home, to an ordinary mother and father in a small town by the sea. His mother was a composer, or at least that's what she dreamed she'd be. So, when her own dreams didn't pan out, she began to dream for him. But then, when he was just 11 years old, he got sick and was forced to stay inside for an entire year. And in that year, he began to worry that he hadn't lived enough. So he made up a story of the great life he thought he wanted to live, which only made him forget the great life he already had, how he had filled a new home with light and joy and promise, how he met a girl, his neighbor, who felt all alone in the world and made her feel okay again, and how, even when he was sick, he still gave his parents hope, how he reminded them exactly who they were after they had almost forgotten. So when he knew he was going to go, he was okay. Because he'd already lived a great life, a full life. And he was everything he needed to be, just as he was.
I'm not going to deny that I teared up again at that, and I probably will every single time I see this, and that's what life is about. His mom is just talking about what life really is. We allow our minds to fool ourselves that life is about achieving something great. Getting somewhere that we're not at right now. Climbing a mountain. Reaching a different summit. And then once we reach that summit, life is about reaching the next summit. But it's not. The moments that are the most meaningful are just the moments with the people we love. And if we do great things, that's not really what our lives are about. It's not what our lives are composed of. When you think about what composes the vast majority of our lives are these times when we aren't writing masterpieces or creating some work of genius. It's just these downtimes. Even if we're engaged in activity, they're ordinary times. That's what composes the vast majority of our lives. And I think that what we see when we see Benny's mom say everything she says here is we watch the culmination of a journey that his mom takes, that the game wants us to take, from believing that we need to get something in order to be contented, and for life to be worth something. To realizing that what life is being present, being aware of these moments that we share with the people we care about. That beauty is ordinary. And that the ordinary, when we spend it in moments of love, is extraordinary. Because family, love, companionship is magical. By itself, without dressing it up, without getting something else. It just is magical already. Wow. That's art. That is a game. Right now, to be honest, as I look upon the gatekeeper in the form of Ernie and Flapjack telling the truthful story, the unembellished story of Benny, I'm really just left in awe. And I'm also reminded that this would be impossible in any other medium besides a video game, because the story could be told of how important it is to be present and how life is really about those beautiful, meaningful, ordinary moments. But the interactivity of the blinking and how that further punches home this desire to be conscious and present and brings us fully engaged into the story as we play Benny, that can only be done by a game. It's a clear example of the heights that can be achieved by an interactive medium.